体温和细菌是你的体温之间迹象。
There seem to be a few questions, so let's start with question and answer.
体温低。
If you speak in Tibetan, please use this one. Okay. If you speak English, then you will talking to.
Now there's a question that someone asked Anna, so should I ask this English question into the microphone here or here? Okay, so the question here that someone asked here, Daniel asked, so does karma's disintegrating transform into karma's disintegratedness? So if yes, does that mean that the karma's disintegrating is the substantial cause of karma's disintegratedness? And if that is so, does that mean karma's disintegratedness is the karmic imprint's disintegrating? Does that explain why Geshe-la said yesterday that karma's disintegratedness is based on the karmic imprints? That's one part of the question. And if it is the substantial cause, therefore, of the karmic imprints, if karma disintegrating is the substantial cause of the karmic imprints disintegrating, that would contradict the idea or the quote from Tenjizo Daba's decisive analysis, which says that the ceasing of karma is the continuum of karma. Also, the question was the disintegratedness of a phenomenon is said to be an affirming negative. So what positive phenomenon does it imply? And also the fact that the disintegratedness is impermanent is explained in order to establish the connection between a karmic cause and its result. Wouldn't it have been enough to explain that on the basis of karmic imprints?
방금 뭐 간디슈야리 내 식바당 저와요. 내 식바당 안에 내기 박사당 저와요. 내 식바당 내기 박사당 저와요. 나타나 뭐 간디슈야리 가르스나 내기 직바데 내기 지신 내 지신바데 안에 내기 시베 뭐도 도다면도 걔들 도나 안에 내기 직바데 내기 시베 녀래 임바타스나 녀래 일남나 다 내기 식바데 안에 내기 바짝이 직바인 바타요. 내기 식바 코나 안에 내기 바짝이 직바인 바타. 가서 내기 식바에 티다 내기를 따발라 시작해서라. 나 내기를 따발때 안에 바짝이를 따발 못 두라. 이 뭐 돌아나 안에 내기를 따발때 내기 식빈이래 임바인자. 다 바짝이 직바 바짝이를 따발다 안에 내기 식바니 내직 말아서. 뒤에 일남나 다양치 펜션 잡에 지도나나 다주나나 디소를 내기 가바디 내기 유인이시 디단게 도움이 되스 컨디션 지디레스 아니 시바스야
레레체야 이게 요거죠. 얘기입니다. 뭐 열어. 어제 뒤로다 레기 미다바티 레기 시버기 닐레르베스 뒤로
Legi mitabadi legi shibu.
닐레르베스 인티 제스나 아니 레기 미다바티 다 레기 박차요로 박차기 미다바기 닐레르베스 어떤 뜻이 있어요?
那这个问题是说，业的无常是业灭的进取因吗？如果说是的话呢，那么业的无常是业的失去的进取因吗？
Karma disintegrates moment by moment, so this disintegrating
디인람나 아니 벌써 빈진 무치기 아니 레시고 레기 균이 송샤스 디는 아 내가 버티 레시고 레기 균이 송샤 디는 게로도스
如果今天说是的话呢，要回答说是。
내기 식바대당 바자기 직반이 직바다.
네.
내기 직바대, 내기 직신바대,
네.
내기 시도 모두 그랬으라. 다디 뭐
저 레기 시바당 박샤기 미다바 지바 차르고도스 디차나 아니
자, 우선 내기 박자 같은 내기 박자기 내기 직바대, 디균 치마대 바자기 직바 차도라.
아
송산다 단다 내기 식바디 균디기 단다
레기 균이 송샤스 디는 게로도스 아
那因此呢，如果在刚才就回答，如果说是的话，什么是呢？就是如果今天回答说业的无常是业的失去的进取因，如果说是的话呢，那这样的说法是否跟福川尊者
disintegrating, so moment by
中观
moment karma
中观
disintegrates.
世
So that disintegrating is like the
在
impermanence
那
of
个
karma,
中
which
观世仪还
transforms
是
into the
中观
impermanence of
世
the
仪还
imprint.
是中观者
Karma gives rise to
里
this
面有
imprint,
过
so
一
it's
句
the
话，
continuum
说
of
他
the
说
imprint.
业灭呢
Therefore,
是
the
是业的去有
disintegratedness
这句
of
话
the，karma
难道不会有
would
忏悔的
become
问题
the
吗？如果回答是的
impermanence
话，
of the imprints. But it is said in the scriptures that the ceasing or the disintegratedness of the karma is actually the continuum of the karma.
딜라디 다직전나 뒤어디 되게 요구매로 섬tem도 그래서 제라마와 건수에 가르치나 레사 찬이 제마 디부디 용해디 레디 가찬에 더 디부디 용도 간데스 용도 그래시디 아니 레다냠도 취미사와세 제지요레스 디기토 용구레스 렌디테기도 다 디나 신치기 미타발라임디 다디 노스노 송로치야 이 제타야 말 야부지 그래서 기와다 가바다 네바스 나오러다 기와다 가바다 네바스디 기비제 네비제 가비제 숨 뒤념도 들어요 저 자와디 링기주 기비 자와 네비 자와 아니 지비 자와디 링기주 이네 제 숨디 뒤념 들어와다 뒤념도 뭐 이네야 미타 보면 이미 최지 자주로다 어디지도 시기도 제지 제 디서도 저기 아니 레스 레기 미타 바스니야 제지 레스는 제지 인서도 비슷한 코드 인서를 something 딜라디 다 레기 미타 바디 균이라나 레기 균만 인게 자주로다 배전을 레기 균 소요래 이생에 바기 다기 하나기 되어가는 신 레레레라나 아니 미타비 균 자주와래 디게도 선선도 코르단들 따나 선도도 코르멘도 something
So the question may have arisen from the understanding that is also found that similar to the Vaibhashika system, where it talks about when we talk about the impermanence of something, it seems to be like a separate entity. So here, having accumulated karma, so then the karma has been accumulated, then it ceases, and after it has ceased, then it becomes something else. It goes into it continues into a different kind of entity. So likewise here in the Vaibhashika system, they talk about impermanence as like something separate from like a separate in the sense that they talk about being produced, abiding, and going out of existence. Those three. So being produced, abiding, and going out of existence. They talk about those three as being separate in the sense that the substance of being produced, the substance of abiding, and the substance of going out of existence, they arise at the same time. But the actual activity of being produced, of abiding, and going out of existence, they are separate, as in like they arise one after the other. They arise gradually. They do not arise together. So the substance of production, the substance of abiding, and the substance of going out of existence, they arise together, because otherwise the phenomenon could not be impermanent. But the actual activity of production and so forth, so production comes first, then abiding, and then going out of existence. So this is according to the Abhidharma Kosa, that's the way they explain it, isn't it? So therefore there's a sense that the impermanence of the karma and the impermanence of the imprint, that they are different continuum.
That the devil in Chigi and Dimitabares, that lay in the Dimitabare, Pikiore, Dinebares, Susu Chimotomaro. Tobe Midamiro, Tobe Monamidamita Chiamoto, Wochigla Chadiota, Zechi, Wochi.
So, according to the Sutra school, the Tantric system, and all the other schools, there is the idea that prevails that actually they are one nature. So the impermanence of something and the phenomenon itself, they are one nature. So therefore, there's really this one thing that you point at. This is not like a different continuum of those two. So it's just one thing that you actually can point your finger at. So this is according to the Sutra school and the other schools, that there are one nature. The impermanence of the phenomenon and the phenomenon itself are one nature.
只是在分别心上有不同的显现而已，但是呢，所指的对象都只是同一个。因此，我这种状况呢，就是体性一，但是呢，繁体是不相同的。
就是我自己上了的快乐呢，아니 내기 균인장 레미다비 균이래 수 개와 파샤네 인비 주치르다.
So because they are one nature, so therefore the continuum of the karma is the continuum of the impermanence of the karma. So they are one continuum. The continuum of the karma is the continuum of the impermanence of the karma.
跟事业的无常的相续这两件事情呢，不但呢是不相违，而且呢是就是因为它是业的相续，所以呢它是业的无常的相续。
这是听没了，第五问题。
Kotiran tene kanjushiyo de karsana kasangi ni bana legi shipa loyati ta pacha yin la thura kasangi sa de legi shipa di pacha mares ani tanda chwa ni ba de chwa soma de karsana tanda mai karsa shipa de mainga yin soira mainga yin lamna ta dojangi karsa kashu de tuba shi phe chu de tuba di karsa ba
So the other question was that disintegratedness of something, of a phenomenon, is a negation, but of a non-affirmative and an affirmative negation, it is an affirmative negation. So what positive phenomenon is affirmed, or what positive phenomenon is implied when you say that the disintegratedness of something is an affirmative negation.
Tadi shibadi mahinga residi ranji kacha kashu de kachi pengi resida. Ani ribora shiba lai mido. Tanguni ne me deva ina tila shiba kichi yoya para mido. Chesa shig res la di tai nasi pegi jana meba cha res. Meba cha residi ani ngari yoya bachi.
So in general we say, for example, that something that never existed, such as the horns of a rabbit, well they don't talk about the disintegratedness of the horns of a rabbit, for example, because here the word disintegrate implies that something has existed before and then it went out of existence. So therefore, when we talk about the disintegratedness, that being an affirmative negation or an affirmative negative, that therefore means that the what is it? implied here is the existence. The former existence is implied. So the existence is a positive phenomenon, and that is what is
变成
implied.
没有这件事情，这个非真它引申出来就是表示它以前有过，现在变成没有。
아니
네, 제가 담아디 단다 디시 가서 레단디 되고기 되어 안에 태가 된데 지도 시방고고 되어서라. 이때나 아니 배나 칼로다 레기 박자단 대다 되는 샤다 레기 박자 거라나 되네야 디기 되어 안에 고토군도 해. 인지민지 안에 지 가서다 레기 시바데다 고기 되어가 가려서.
내기 바차를 때네 아니 내 사네다 지금 지구도 같은 민기리스 렌디다 바차를 때는 기기를 납샤는 되기도 시바기 지시고도 와서
那这个问题就是说，我们说呢，业障
The
以后
last
要怎么
question
改
is,
过呢？
well, the reason why disintegratedness being impermanent, why that is actually
为什么一定
explained,
要加上
is
业
to
灭这个概
prove
念呢
that？when you
一定要说是
accumulate a
透过
cause,
业
when
灭
you，
然后使
accumulate
得
a
已经造
karma,
过的这个
so
业
then
在结束之后，
eventually you
还
get
是具有
a
后的
result. So
为什么
that
要
connection
做
between the karma
业的实
and
现？
the result. And the question is then, why do you need this explanation? Just talking of imprints would be enough. That you leave an imprint and therefore you get a result. So that explanation would have been sufficient to explain this connection.
디 도바디 가르스고레 단다 주타마 시 수지를 마제기 도바차데요 그래서는 제라마는 레취사에 더네 기시에와 아니 센센데 군시기 지시고레 란주바 가시기 따디 단다 란주베기 따 이기 남시기 지시고레 단주의 시비기 지시고레 남산 카두고라 바샤르데니 기기를 와서 렌디 수지 있대고 봐 따딩은 저를 도바디 기에 가르스나 바샤 제외 되기다마다 지부지냐 바샤디 파게 제외지 섬로 콜데 바샤 제외 섬로 코야리 가르스나 엄줄을 자자니 바샤 우용그레 바샤 우용서 바샤세 제지제 디 용초조지 섬로 코버로 디 긴제
So this kind of question, well, from the point of view of the imprints, actually, this is not something any of the tenet systems, they don't differentiate from the point of view of the imprints, they don't differ from the point of view of the imprints. Why? Because in the Vaibhashika school, we talk about the aspect of the imprint or the karma not getting wasted. So the karma does not get wasted, so there's this kind of characteristic that the Vaibhashika school talks about, which is that non-wastedness, that kind of characteristic that goes along with the karma. Then, according to the Chittamatra school, they speak about the mind bases of all, the kind of storage consciousness where the instants are left. And then, according to the Svatantrika system, they describe a mental consciousness, which again is always there, which abides in the time and serves as a storehouse of the imprints. So here in the Prasangika school, well, we talk about the imprints which are left here, but because there's a sense that these imprints, which I've explained earlier or yesterday, that these imprints are some kind of substance. So therefore, not to get the sense that the imprints are a type of substance, in order to avoid that, therefore there's the explanation of the disintegratedness of karma, that also being explained.
나 바차스나 다다다 레기 기지시 비감다 바샤스나 다 치마케지 뉴버디시거 뉴버스 르디자네 먼저 페이지에 봐이나 치만남이 토그레스 스티르 딜라 바샤스 민다 엔 토그레스 가르스나 투버디 요르 와슬라베타 도다시나 디디차루다 레딜라데네 티부친 토그레스 가르스나 바샤 요레스라나 렌디 오늘 파게 너지기 탄이 잘 되죠 많이 거지 오늘 가르쳐서는 두그레 가르치는 투버 요로 왔어 투그레 가르치는 바샤 요로 와 레디 된다라 가르쳐서는 투그레 가르치는 투버 요로 왔어 딜렌디 레레마서 투그레 가르치는 아니 파게 디파라다 아니 군시디 파게 요레 고 가는 군시딩도 마 군시의 팀의 소리를 제 디네야 샤르 그래서 고 군시마디 세다 투그레 가르치는 아니 취미사와서 제지 요레서 투그레 가르치는 코 가산에 그 20을 하대요 그래서 도스케지시에는 것이 해줘요. 제 투그레 가르치는 바자 요레는 투그레 가르치는 누가 요레서 투그레 가르치는 투그레스. 딜. 진짜 딜 답을 이거 말.
So with regard to the imprints here, so we say there are imprints left, but this is not really clear in the sense that there's a kind of potential, some kind of potency of eventually leading to some kind of result. But other than that, it's not really clear what these imprints are. It's this kind of potential, the ability for something to be produced, a kind of fruition or operational result being produced. That is it. So it's like saying it can be produced. That's all it is. So it can be produced. So this is really what we're talking about when we talk about imprints. Yes, they're imprints. Well, what does that mean? It can be produced. There can be a result. Nothing else really appears to the mind. It's really not that clear. It's just this idea, yes, it's possible. Yes, it's possible that from a karmic cause, you have a result. That possibility. That's all that is implied when we talk about these imprints. But when we talk about the other systems, for example, according to Chittagama school, they speak of the mind basis of all. So that after the karmic action has been completed, now an imprint is left on that mind basis of all, and that remains on there. So there's something kind of in between, something kind of easier to understand, something in between that connects the cause and the resulting fruition of the karmic result. The fruition of a certain result. So likewise in the Vaibhashika system, they talk about karma comes along with this characteristic of not being wasted, some kind of separate characteristic of not being wasted. So that characteristic goes on until eventually the result is experienced. So, but here, all we have when we speak about imprints, there's just this. The karmic cause ceases, and then it's just the ability for it to arise. So that is just not sufficient. So therefore, this is a kind of doubt that arises independent of any of the tenet systems. And Geshe-la said he had that question himself at some point.
아니 가장님아 주스라이르 바가와라 따용디 레벨디 딘체스는 바기 뒤차를 레레니 뒤차를 레레니 난게레스 발렌 다와자베기 디나로라 뒤차를 레레니 난게 말이 초보디 난게레스 진짜 다 디리거디 추키니 니 가르테네스나 다 본바도비 다 도바지 게온디 아니 본바미다바 있나다 디도용디 전에 다 능시 기지 다 신도 차워르레 열다 뒤뒤 통대 기지레레 리레네 보면미다 마도스 추덤니 균디 도르마도 리레 마도스 삼르드니실레 다 디란다 테스트라이드 다원나 리레네 마도네 리레네 난그리베시디 다 리레네 마나라나 다 시바마잉이 차루거라 다 디네마 티케지시온디 다 시바마잉이 제지 기지 리레 체르나 시바마잉이 제 추덤니 균디 에니 시바인데 딘디 삼르지 콜 This local coin, take it to the Moshi, Portata Lodge. That Shiva Maying is a career and the Pachaka little Niva Kichi Tamurin and Niva some che, and Niva di choose Tommy on this and any Yurieki, Shiva di Chatonich. The Dilana and to the Moshi, the Majini, Namjin Shiva, Zeche, and Pachati Tayo Sharo. That another engine and Niva say the Zeche, Shiva Tayo Sharo. Chesata. 이 직전에 선을 갈라오다 제버체 망다라 오르다 탈체라면도 데스 인티네 파체오시라 제메 샤시
So, as explained before, so when we talk about, for example, the pillar, we talk about the pillar as like when the pillar appears to us, it's all the different subtle imprints of the subtle particles that appear to us. So, according to one explanation, each of the subtle particles are being perceived, but according to Chandrakirti, it is actually the collection of these particles, all these particles appearing to us, and therefore it's that collection that we take to mind. So when we talk about, when we realize a vase, for example, then we realize the kind of the collection of all the different parts, of all the subtle particles, the collection of those that we realize. But do all the particles appear? All the particles of what we perceive, do they appear? Well, we have to say that they do appear. So all of those appear. But if we divide these up, so Geshe-la said he had this idea you could divide up consciousness in like many different moments. So like in each moment you could perceive something in each moment, then each moment becomes some kind of potency in itself. So therefore the kind of consciousness disappears in that moment because you have all these moments of consciousness, and only the continuum of those moments is the actual consciousness. So all these potencies would therefore be all these different potencies. If they come together as a continuum, then you have an actual consciousness. So this is the kind of dialogue that Geshe-la had at some point with regard to the consciousness basically. As usually the consciousness is seen as substantially existent and the inputs are seen as imputably existent. But here's the other way around. The consciousness is seen as imputably existent and the imprints are what are substantially existent, because the idea is that these substantially exist in many moments. They are the kind of imprints and then they lead to the consciousness, which is the imputably existent phenomena. So that's kind of his view on this. But it should be the other way around, where the consciousness is the substantially existing phenomenon, and the potential, the potencies, they are the imputed phenomena. So he's kind of done it exactly the other way around. His view shows exactly the opposite of what it should be. So anyhow, this is a kind of view, this is a kind of question that arose in this continuum that does not relate to any of the four tenet systems, and this is something where there's too much investigation, too much analysis, so for the time being, let's just leave it.
所以刚好就会整个反过来，也就是说，其实习气它是应该是一个施设有的法，那心事呢，这以下部中医的看法来说，心事才是实质有的法。可在老师刚才的想法当中，刚好整个反过来，变成心事呢变成施设有的法，那习气呢才变成实质有的法。那这个呢，这种主张跟下部中医的看法是整个完全相反的。那讲到这里，老师就在想说，当时他的这个想法呢，这种观则应该过头了，就是应该是说做过头的这种观则，所以呢，想到那里他就停下来，就没有再继续往下追了。
到底老少的这个歌曲呢，跟不能这么了，跟你去学，跟连我说的给送嘛送，你什么东西苦苦都肯定那是，跟你学的这，你跟啊，第连的了，都真有了，都连到唱他们不要了，但天地给这些用的真的，但아니 딜레 차로 저는 누가 인사를 했어. 다야 기기도 제가 니시와도 기회디 때 기기도 내가 나서 파기 파기지 참 안 되는 누가 제 누가 뒤수 도는데 둘째는 만나는데 왜 참참 들으시 되기도 쓰고 저러다.
So Geshe-la once asked Panditara about this idea that actually when you have many small moments of something, so with regard to the consciousness previously, that each moment is just a potency, and then that leads to the continuum of consciousness. So Geshe-la asked Panditara about this idea, and Geshe-la's response was, well, when you look at a phenomenon that is made of many different particles, so when you go onto a subtler level, on a very subtle level, all you have is this kind of potency. So on the subtlest type of level, the particles kind of disappear, and all you're left with are these subtle potencies. And then they come together and form the particles and so forth, and of course the environment. So then Geshe-la didn't answer directly. This was not a direct answer to his question with regard to the consciousness, but Geshe Panditara kind of put forth a similar kind of idea where he said on a subtler level all you have is just potential, just potency, and then these rough phenomena can't come into existence. So that seems to have been a similar thought, a similar idea that Genpa Panditara
had. Gengi Sungye de Peche Tanda Patu Yuebe Nambegi Da Shung Namlo La Peche Kung Yiki Mare Rakhabure. Jezan Di Tabuchi Gengi Sungye Di Tabuchi Jamgun Muchige Yang Chik Sungye Chi Nansuta Nanki Dulsene Da Nankasena Parna Tongba Dervada O Parna Tongba Taharala Pana Tomba del Ta Chashim Chen, that on Bigis, Kijama Imbaji, Yima Chashim Chen, that Chashi Tamu Jorada, Tomba Pran Chashi Chen, Tendigi Tamu, Di Tendo, and Sachu Melung, Sachu Me Lungi, that Chumashi Duldi, that Nubi number you think, Dulmeva Chen, that Dulmeva Nabra Takache, Nubi number you think. But Tendiji Jamun was sitting in Sunda.
So likewise, Dimanitava also his explanation here. So this cannot be found actually. This explanation of this very subtle potency that is found when one separates these particles. So this cannot be found anywhere in the scriptures. This explanation one does not find in the scriptures. Also, His Holiness often gives this explanation when he speaks about what are called space particles. So here, space in the sense of the actual space, not the uncompounded space, but actual space, impermanent space. So there's something called space particles. So when we talk about the space in front of us, if we were to take it apart, if we were to take apart the space in front of us, what is in front of us basically, not with our senses, but with our mental consciousness. If we were to go subtler and subtler and subtler, so at some level, from the point of view of the elements, so the particles which are a composite of the earth, fire, water and space element, so these kind of particles, if we were to take these particles in front of us and were to go even subtler, all one is left with is a kind of potency, so a kind of potential or potency. So therefore, ordinarily, when we talk about therefore these very subtle particles, so there's this space particle, therefore that's the kind of subtlest, this kind of potency, this is called the space particle. So all these particles, if you go subtler and subtler and subtler, you find subtler and subtler particles, and eventually you are left with what is called the space particle, this kind of potency and potential. And then again, if you take it the other way around, when you start with this potency, with this space particle, and you add many of those together and you go onto a coarser level, you become coarser and coarser and coarser, then you have the other particles, and then you have the ordinary physical world.
虚空当中最维系的四大种围城的这个能力，它慢慢的这个苏醒，慢慢的醒觉，然后之后呢，再慢慢的形成四大种看得见的这种围城，然后再慢慢扩大。
因为我们现在空格的有的是要学了，估计呢空的。
So when His Holiness was asked, what is the source? What is the source for you saying this? His Holiness was jokingly pointing at himself and saying, "This is the source." His Holiness pointed at himself and said, "This is the source."
你的人那还不知道了。
So saying in my case that I'm the
他也
source,
这样做的，他也不根据他的话，那是不是太
sneaky?
太傲慢了，还是说太自大了？
你听我现在，有人，对，就有人，就啊，给去了去，啊。能去这次多把的，全部去3天去，看你的去，你当不得了那个，那的，刚才人家都被在死马路个3天的，你如果那边个他你两兄弟人么等多的天去看朋友嘛是那些谁的个，那第二呢，接着么去个的多的个空降的个，中间的是别人把你别告诉那个哪里的下面的，那些你不能在社会头，当然是个那新加坡的。その目またもパッダンとかしてパッダンでてらしゃこですね。いねやったらランジャとべ関西ランジャとかせでせぶじさんにじじめてみたりとしでランジャとからここゆばててかでちねやしゅんでねけねこんでけいうなただじゃんじゃるたんだらやただまと絶対にしべきぜゆであいチェんだねかすかれがドアぎついおてたんちねで제일 다행히 제일 대체다 강사람이 들어고 부르는 데 주시 강사들이 장도 들어라 된지를 장 인지고는 되도가 있었어. 딜레디다 가래 가서런지 되게 지수유 메시에디 콩가르는 스티와디르
가서 라자도 비즈니스 네 세대 디타치네 세본케 네 이렇게 요르메스나
다단다 두번이 심을 지도 기지지 요로
어디지 요로나 때마다 심박해네
네
굉장히 마스데 손에 도바시사 तदी खाने जाऊं जो दुआ ने शिवा ना से जाऊं तो तासे तानी से जेयो खाने रोते मेरे जी तो खासाते भी जाऊं ते दाम का राजा तो जेयो नहीं दे जीवाट लोगों ये ना से
아서 이제 뒤에 지수 유명기 지 시고로 어디 또 된지 콩 가려야 됐어 같이 콩 요마를 쓰기도 했어 이게 루베기 시시저랬어 내가도
So, again, that's a question here. He has a question that says, for a long time, he has wondered about this, the idea of talking about the lack of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. So, the lack of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self is the opposite of such a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. Where is that mentioned? In which sutric text, so in the Indian sutras, or in the Indian treatises, I should say, so according to the Indian treatises, or according to the sutric volumes, where's the explanation of such a lack of self-sufficient, substantially self? So, Vishnu spoke about that some people say there's a form of Devas, which talks about a kind of self, a kind of a middling kind of self which needs to be realized, and some people interpret this to mean the lack of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. Then in the Chandra Viduji's tenet book, on the tenet, there's a reference to the Vinaya system, where it talks about substantial existence as opposed to imputed existence. So here, the question is what is mentioned in this Vinaya text, this substantial existence, is that the same kind of substantial existence when you talk about a self-sufficient, substantially existent self, or is it a different types of substantial existence? So anyhow, the question really is that some people say in the Gelugpa tradition, they talk about this lack of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self, but is there really an Indian source text that mentions the same? And if so, what would that be?
미세기 란제 뒤비 지수 유바 가자진의 매바시에 근데 지근데 땡기미도 그래서는 인제 동동 진행지 맞추나 안 비절로도 있잖아요 미숙하게 더 리그마를 하시네
So Lisa is saying, I have not actually encountered this when reading the Indian scriptures. I've not really encountered this idea of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self, and then the opposite as like seeing this as an object of negation, and so therefore the opposite, lack of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. So the object as an object of negation is the absolute negation of such a self. But the reason being that unless someone asks me this question, when I read this, I don't pay attention. So if someone has that question and when I read, then I pay attention with regard to the wordings. But no one has asked me this and I haven't paid attention.
아니 두번에 송바디 딱 공샤 총에 되지래 그래서는 민가라네 말하는 되다 다가라 차대요라 제일 진바다는 이제 뒤에 제일 진을 제버치도 말아 다 지부지야 있는 다가라 제도 말아다
So then with respect to the Vinaya, the kind of source text here that we find as in like the Vinaya scriptures. So here the kind of, this definitely serves as a source in the sense that we do not differentiate between substantially existent and self-sufficient substantially existent. So they mean the same thing. So that would definitely refer to the same kind of idea. The kind of substantially existent you find in the Vinaya is the same as that self-sufficient substantially existent.
타니 디킬루버기 차레스키제 디용담을 타나 딜랑이 디킬루마 인인치 기타라버레 이 길루마 인인치 기라용도 전에 패싱 예제나 저기서도 나투마레데 카시기디 디치기도 하 제라마와도 팀메다 팀이 주도마 요 치미도 먼저 쇼나로다 팀메다 팀이 주도마 요 치 팀이 티진스나 아니 전된다 전 신된 서버자치 중 같은 기지시 지라마와도 팀이 주도마와도 티진 주도마와시나 따르기 돈이 치도 치기로 와 카시기디 요 치미도 마치 인자 아니 팀이 다음에 또 쓰디 아니 그게 지라마와도 도지부터 저기 다음에 또 그랬어 가사이 다음에 또 그랬어 가사 다음에 차라리 요와 기자 마시 받치 가사 다음에 또 그랬어 다라 카도 취기 다음에 또 와 말했어 두 라테이도 그래서 다 된지 시도는 신체가 있나 디 마티고 들지래 가르에서는 단다디 무시 죄 나로래 뒤어라 담에 풍부 점니도스 담에 세리 풍부 점레스 레디 다 풍부를 못 하대비 다디 가고마도 가서는 좀 가면도 다 디나신 다다 가서 장사다 다 센즈미 중요로 다 센즈미 뒤주 참에 나로래 다른 용도 풍부를 못 하대비 다디 가대바마도 벨리 신비 다 가에 좀 담에 송 가서 담에 송용도 정말 풍부를 못 하대비 다디 가면도 진짜 다 디지도 전에 같이 사고도 가장님은 이제 중요하듯이 부모를 못하디비 다음에 봤어야 되다 이제도 다음에 봤어야 돼 차라리 먹기지 시에는 콩디기도 찾아서 이러러다 다디 차라 채나야 디 콩들이 말와 이내 그런 주 중앙으로 다음에 가서 다음에 시용도 전에 대점시 소는 것이죠.
So, when those who would say that in the Gelugpa tradition, the source for that, so using this kind of wording, this kind of phrase, so lack of self-sufficiency, essentially self, that this is not found in the Indian source text. Well, this is probably someone who does not follow the Gelugpa tradition, and then would say that it would be someone who doesn't differentiate between the lower systems, in other words, the fundamental vehicle tenets and the fundamental vehicle in general, or the universal vehicle in general and the fundamental vehicle tenets. So here there's a difference there between Hinayana and Hinayana tenets and Mahayana and Mahayana tenets. So actually when we talk about the difference between Hinayana or fundamental vehicles, so fundamental vehicle and Mahayana, fundamental vehicle and universal vehicle, the difference between the two, the difference between Hinayana and Mahayana is from the point of view of attitude, is from the point of view of motivation, of wanting to become self-liberated or want to become fully enlightened. But different to that, we speak of the Hinayana tenet and the Mahayana tenet. Those are different. So in the Gelugpa scriptures, they're described as being different, where here the Hinayana tenet system, the Vaibhashika and the Sautrantrika, they talk about the realization only of selflessness, and here it's only core selflessness that is realized, not selflessness in general. Whereas according to the Mahayana tenet system, so the Chittamatra and the Madhyamika, so those two realize also on top of that selflessness of phenomena. So it's a type of core selflessness. This is not the same as saying Hinayana or fundamental vehicle in general, where selflessness is realized. Selflessness of phenomena must be realized. Selflessness of causes and phenomena is realized. There's difference exist in terms of what is realized. According to the Hinayana and the Mahayana, both they realize in both systems they realize the same as an emptiness. When you talk about the Hinayana tenet system and the Mahayana tenet system, then there's different realization. There's a different realization with regard to selflessness. So the core type of selflessness is realized by lower tenet systems, the Vaibhashika and the Sautrantrika, and then the subtler selflessness, in other words, emptiness of phenomena, is realized according to the Chittamatra and according to the Madhyamika school. So also in the Chittamatra scriptures we find an explanation of the lack of a self that exists as separate from the aggregate, or there's the explanation that the self is not the mere aggregate. So that is a course of type of selflessness that is prescribed, that is described in these scriptures. So for example, in the grounds of a bodhisattva, in the bodhisattva grounds, in that text also it speaks of the lack of the self, or the lack of something existing as the self existing as being a different nature from the aggregates. So this is not the same type of self here, the lack of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self, but nonetheless it speaks of a different types of selflessness altogether.
제가 되게 적세능로라 죄다 지부지 양진이 담에라고 인도다 랑산지지 아니 통놈기다 또에디 가르지시나 안티니마 송지 대방원벌도 봐 대양스 대방원벌도 봤을 뒤로다 다음에 무슨 또에 대방 무슨 또에 인도다 랑산지 풍부 점도 믹싱스 풍부 남리 귀나 대신도 줄비다 민위바 나서 줄바나스 세우시고 송다 풍부 점마도 풍부리 귀나서는 풍부리 로수 다리면이바 매바 어디 권니 아니 페인인데다 랑산지 좀 도버레스 다 디송에 되기 베게 지라마오다 센즈마 혼주의 가서다니 수행이 텐주의 수행들이 라바 인베 되버래 초진의 가상들이 두고 가서는 이제 되게 지수에 받아 공부 중심이다 매버디 타라네스의 공을 다다 주도 그래서는 대방법을 또 해야 되는 중간에 숨도.
So when we talk about this Bodhisattva Bhumi, when we talk about this text, it speaks about, so this is not from the point of view of Madhyamika, but from the point of view of the Chitta Mantra system. So here it speaks about the Hira and the solitary realizer when they realize directly the truth. So here it means like selflessness, realizing selflessness directly. Well, what they realize is basically the absence of a separate kind of self. So the absence of the absence of a separate type of self. So this is what they talk about as of what is being realized. And so according to the Vaibhashika school, according to the Chitta Mantra school, they all speak of course of the selflessness that is realized. So here in this case, as in like what they find is they do not find as an aggregate. They do not find a self that exists separate as from the aggregate. So it's really like the only self you can find is the aggregates themselves. So therefore, this explanation you find in the Bodhisattva Bhumi, in that text, which says that according to the lower system, this is the kind of self that is realized. It's of course a type of self that is realized according to this system. And likewise, we also have the explanation that you can talk about self-sufficient substantially existent self as being equally coarse in the sense as finding a self that exists from the exists separate from the aggregate. So if you apprehend a self that exists as separate from the aggregates, that is the same as apprehending a self-sufficient, substantially existing self. So that kind of explanation we went through before, positing the same kind of subtlety of those two self-graspings.
디와들의 찌디를 풍부라 마토피 강사 매버타와 콤버체발레 중고스 아니 시지 집에 나버터 비주의 가르레스나 아니 힘이 취기담이디 마수 제단 윤지 다에기 미거디 가르레스나 풍부 마토피 아니 강사 매버.
So Geshe-la gave this quote again from the Bodhisattva Bhumi, which is this Chitta Mantra text, which talks about, therefore, there's hearers and solitary realizers in order to eliminate afflictive obscurations. What they have to realize that except for the aggregates, there is no self, there is no separate self. So they realize the absence of a self that is separate from the aggregates. So other than the aggregates, there's no self to be found. So therefore this kind of separate self is being denied here, it's being refuted here, and the understanding of that, the realization of that, leads to the elimination of the afflictive obscurations. And then it continues saying, well, with respect to the cognitive obscuration, what needs to be realized, and then so forth.
이제 풍부리 로수르디 풍부를 떼바메비 풍부는 전면 된신기 일단 풍부를 떼바메비 시대 라고 와서 고시리고로 랑자와 지발에 따라 고아디 따라 리드워드.
So here, saying one does not find a self that exists separate from the aggregates. So in other words, one does not find a self that exists as independent of the aggregates. So this kind of independent self, or self-sufficient self, that is kind of the idea that's here. So this is definitely something we find in this text. And that's the second question.
他现在的这些都的开始了那的想就现在的去他说的呢namchi shong shen se de dan de to la le开始了那其他想就现se明白讲究的给他现在的你他说的这些教的什么来等的他说的那么说生个那不生个什么等的呢这钱哪来呀想去三八四的怎么了呢想去三八四的些的了呢那告诉是呢싫어想去了没办法想去 인지의 심정 단 semban 스트레스 좀 네 대나신 게 다네 가서 볼텐다 졸라 티가 나려야 하송 니지다 하송되다 공부할 때네 라니 샹주 토고 같고 아니 돈이 또 싫어 과단 제바 네네 라니 샹주 토뉴 같고 그거는 수도 선택에 지원고래서 레지스무도 데이터 대신에 아니 남신 힘보지나야 아니 남체로이드 차발라 티칭 남치 루용조로이드 차고 그래서네 레지송데 대다가 때문에 장추로이드 차야 남체로이드 차야도 방가로 티칭 남치로이드 차고 문제지 아니 배는 나도 자고 신샤함도 최선 넘어 자된주 자송 공비시로 생파스 되지않는데 땡이 대대라 대바이나다 장주 선바들이야 앵게바들 남의 장주 로이드 창미지 아니 뒤에 공에서 되지모도 땡 용바이나다 아니 조다 오메게 아니 가수를 줘라야 장주 선유에서는 다들 아니 줘라마 가서 아니 님이 진고 보면 미미별 통하면서 뒤에는 시절에 또 또는 시지만 차상에는 장주 선바에 쓰고 있는 것도 때때지 네 샤하고 지금 그 간대지
귀자만 기가리
줘라면 네 님이 진고 보면 미미별 통하면서 줘 뒤거서 뒤 시절에 인도 아니 가수를 근데 디신이 뭐도다 뒤인 대바는 가수 줘라 통대다 하는 다지 상말로는 장주 선바에 쓰고 있대요
저러나
제라몬로 라운단도 쓰고 싶어라 다네 다들 가서 줘라 티가는데 쓰고 싶어라 어디서 자산 줄수 있도록 미미변의 통화면서 미미의 강사들의 실력을 지향 티바라 산티십의 강사서 티바라 산티십의 강사들이 다음에 뭐 통해 셔라마 네 가서 된다네 팀에게는 조담화가 되지 자 팀에게 조담화 도대로 되잖아 나올로
내가 이제 도도적이 나와있나 아니 장추 레이셔와 다 장추 레비 답에는 남친 나와있나 남친 남나다 하기 다 티징기 시동 제수 차상 캔딩이지 디 계제시와라 디로를 샤와라 테버침이 시동 제수 차상로를 샤와지 거로 하기 산지부가 제기 시동 제수 디로를 샤나 신이 디칭이 디신 신로를 샤기로 다 디계제시 온데 전에 아니 다 장추 선바이나 된지지 루이도 샤고를 했어 디이나 다 지라마와다 되데베기다 장추 선바 유버 송도 숑나로라 디게디 로 샤기마로 하기 고아 차기 말이 켈링기 거라 말이 이치에 요 말이 디치디 아니 간절했어 이런 식으로 하다